Welcome to Talks on Web. We have all been in interviews, and the guy asks you, do you know what PostCSS is? Now, even if you don't know it, they're hoping to see if you're familiar with that technology. This would put you above the rest of the candidates who are hearing it for the first time and are going to go home and Google this up. So, in this video, I'm going to tell you what PostCSS is, where it is used, and most likely if you've been using Tailwind CSS, Vite, you're already using this tool without knowing it because those technologies rely on this tool. Lastly, I'm going to tell you when you would need this tool. So picture an example. Let's say you never plan on getting on a plane, which is fine, but at least you should know to get from America to the UK, there's a big sea in between. I'm probably going to need a plane. I can't drive there. Knowing how to get from point A to point B is necessary in the IT world because tomorrow, when you're in that type of situation, at least you know there's a way. Let's get into it. Let's start with what it is. If you look at the word post, it means after. So after CSS, meaning after you're done writing your CSS, it starts to turn it into a tree, something they call the abstract syntax tree. Now, what is that? It's basically something very simple. A good example is when you write HTML, that HTML is turned into a document object model, which is really a tree. And if you look closely at that tree, every element has been turned into an object. They do that because now they can call functions which will change that object. And those functions are called APIs. In case you're saying what APIs, every time you wrote down document.getElementById, .addElementListener, those were functions or methods you were calling to change a specific object in that tree. And that's why they do it. They've been doing it for HTML and now they've done it for CSS. And this is what PostCSS does. It turns your CSS into a tree so it can call functions and make changes to it. Now you're probably wondering, well, what kind of changes can I make to CSS? For one, you can minify the CSS. For those of you new to the field, minifying CSS is it takes out all the white spaces in the file, makes the file size much more smaller, and when downloads on your browser, your site loads much more faster. Next, it makes it friendly for older browsers. Now, the technical term for this is polyfills. What this basically means is if someone has an older browser, they have not updated yet for whatever reason might be, this will go and write older CSS so your CSS works with it. So you wrote down the current version, the new CSS, and it can go behind the scenes and make sure it works with the older browsers, the newer browsers. That's its headache. And it's not just taking shots in the dark, it uses something called Browsers List. Now Browsers List lets all these plugins know at least 0.5% of the world is using this browser. Also, in the last 2 years, has anybody used this browser? If these two conditions don't meet, among many others, Browsers List will not include that browser in its list. Simple enough, right? Now let's move on. It will also look into your CSS and try to find any errors in it. Now the technical term for this is static code analysis tool. And all it's doing is going through your CSS to see if there's any mistakes that you might have made on it. Now, I could keep going on with this list. There are over 300 plugins available that you could use to turn your CSS into whatever you want. One of them is turning your Sass into plain CSS. Now all of this is configurable. You can take any of these plugins and change the configuration so it works the way you want it to. The next question is, where is it used? More than likely you have heard of Tailwind. Tailwind uses PostCSS in the background. So what it does first is Tailwind takes your HTML and turns it into a tree. Takes out all the classes that you have in your HTML and then it gives it to PostCSS. PostCSS then takes those classes that are made specifically for Tailwind, converts that into a simple CSS file, which is then used by your browser. Now before it gives you that simple CSS file, it checks for polyfills. Again, polyfills is it takes your CSS and makes sure it works with older browsers. And these browsers, again, are based off the browsers list, meaning that it's for browsers that are actually being used by people, not just by every browser that was made in the history of the world. If you go to PostCSS's website, I'll include the link in the description. Scroll down just a little bit and you'll see the sponsor section. you can see Tailwind CSS hasn't sponsoring them. There's a link right below that. If you click on that, you'll be taken to this page. Again, gotta scroll down just a little bit, and you will see this section, Top Financial Contributors. And you can see Tailwind CSS has been sponsoring them since March of 2020, among many other companies. Next, you can minify it for production if you want to. All of this is being done with PostCSS. Also, Vite uses this as well. So when would you need this tool? Now, the word magic is used a lot in programming, and it's used to refer to things that are done for you, and they're so complicated, but you're amazed at how simple their API, in other words, you calling a function, it just gives you that output. This is great in many cases. You don't need to know everything about the web. However, you do need to know that how the hell is it that Tailwind takes a bunch of classes and turns them into this simple CSS file, which only has the classes you used out of the many classes that Tailwind provides. Well, that's done through PostCSS. Now, when would you need this tool? Let's say tomorrow your company wants to do something complicated and it's beyond what they were doing to land this major client and whatnot. At that point in that meeting, or at least during that conversation, you could tell them, guys, there's something called PostCSS, Tailwind is using it, Vite is using it, and this thing is built in Node.js. It's actually a build tool. Now, what's a build tool? VS Code or any IDE you might be using is actually a building tool. You use it to build your code, and then that code is sent to your server, which is then deployed. Similarly, PostCSS is built in Node.js, and it takes your CSS and converts it into a much better CSS by making sure it works on all the browsers, or it doesn't have any extra spaces in it, among many other things you could do with it. So, hopefully you found this content helpful.
Hit that subscribe button.